The year 1869 began for me at Pokrovskoye in the quiet of an unremarkable household. I remember snow most clearly. The world soft and unhurried around me. The days unfolding slowly. You need not follow every word that follows. Let your eyes close whenever they wish, and simply rest here with me as the story unfolds. The cold air carried the scent of pine and woodsmoke, a familiar perfume that grounded me in this moment. I was born into the rhythm of the Siberian winter, where the earth remained hard and the light stayed low for many months. My father, Ephim, moved through the wooden house with the steady gait of a man who knew the soil better than any scholar. He wore rough woolen garments that smelled of the stable and the field, and his hands were calloused from years of labor. My mother, Anna, sat by the crackling stove, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. She hummed old hymns while she worked, her voice blending with the sound of the wind. Outside, the house itself was small, built of logs that fit together tightly to keep the cold at bay. Inside, the air was thick with the warmth of the oven and the smell of baking bread. I grew up hearing the stories of the old men, tales of saints and demons, of miracles and tragedies. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the fabric of our reality. I remember the long nights spent by the fire, listening to the tales of the wandering monks and the holy fools who traveled the frozen roads. Their voices were low and rhythmic, like the sound of water flowing under ice. I learned to distinguish the different tones of the wind, the way it whispered through the cracks in the walls or howled against the roof. The silence of the village was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a sleigh bell or the crackle of the fire. The village was a close, knit community where everyone knew everyone's business and where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were often blurred. We were not rich, but we were not destitute, living in a wooden house that stood firm against the elements. The days were filled with simple tasks, the kind that required patience and a steady hand. I watched the snow pile up against the window frames, creating a white barrier that separated us from the outside world. Inside, the light from the stove danced on the walls, casting long shadows that moved slowly across the floor. The smell of dried herbs hung in the air, mixed with the scent of old paper and the faint aroma of the icons that hung on the walls. A quiet room in a St. Petersburg apartment held a heavy velvet curtain drawn against the winter light. Dust motes danced slowly in the single beam that pierced the gloom of the afternoon. An old porcelain teacup sat on a wooden table, its surface cracked, but still holding a faint warmth. The silence of the room was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a sleigh bell. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards as the sun began its slow descent behind the Neva River. The air smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper, a scent that lingered in the stillness. A small icon of the Virgin Mary hung on the wall, its gold leaf tarnished by time. The room felt suspended in a moment of peace, untouched by the turmoil outside the window. The heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the city, creating a sanctuary of quiet reflection. The light faded gradually, leaving the room in a soft, gray twilight that invited rest. In those early days, the world was small and contained within the walls of our home. The seasons turned with a slow, deliberate pace, marking the passage of time in ways that felt natural and inevitable. I learned to read the signs of the weather in the way the birds flew or the way the snow fell. The cold was a constant companion, but it was never an enemy. It was simply a part of the landscape, as much a part of the land as the trees or the river. The fire in the stove provided a sense of safety, a warm center around which life revolved. I remember the feeling of the wood being placed on the flames, the way the heat spread through the room, warming the air and the bones. The years passed quietly, filled with the simple rhythms of peasant life. I watched the snow fall and melt, in a cycle that seemed endless. The world outside was vast and mysterious, but inside, I was born in the village of Pokrovskoye, where the earth is hard, and the winters stretch out like a long, silent breath. My father, Efim, was a man of the soil who understood the cycles of planting and harvest better than any scholar in the city. My mother, Anna, was a woman of deep faith, her life marked by the rhythms of the church and the daily struggles of a household. We were not rich, but we were not destitute, living in a wooden house that stood firm against the elements. The village was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone's business and where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were often blurred. I grew up hearing the stories of the old men, tales of saints and demons, of miracles and tragedies. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the fabric of our reality. I remember the long nights spent by the fire, listening to the tales of the wandering monks and the holy fools who traveled the frozen roads. The smoke from the stove filled the room with a thick, acrid scent that clung to the woolen coats hanging on the walls. My father taught me the value of hard work and the dignity of labor, his hands rough and calloused from years of tilling the frozen ground. He showed me how to fix the plow and how to care for the livestock, his voice low and steady as he spoke of the land. My mother instilled in me a reverence for the divine, her eyes soft and her hands often folded in prayer. She read to me from the scriptures, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of the ancient words. The village school was a small, drafty building where I learned to read and write in the Cyrillic script, though my education was limited by the resources available in such a remote region. Despite these limitations, a natural curiosity drew me toward spiritual matters from an early age, a pull that I could not ignore. The harsh climate of Siberia shaped my character, making me resilient and accustomed to physical hardship. I learned to endure long winters and the scarcity of food that often plagued our region, surviving on what the land provided. The silence of the northern forests was a constant companion, broken only by the howl of the wind or the crack of ice on the river. The wooden walls of our home were thick and sturdy, built to withstand the brutal cold that swept down from the north. A large stove dominated the center of the room, its iron surface glowing with the heat of burning logs. Smoke curled from the chimney, rising into the gray sky and marking the presence of human life in the wilderness. The floor was covered with rough, hewn planks, worn smooth by the footsteps of generations. In the corner, a wooden chest held our few possessions, wrapped in linen and tied with twine. The windows were small and set deep into the walls, allowing only a sliver of light to enter during the long days of winter. Outside, the snow lay deep and untouched, a white expanse that stretched to the horizon. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree branch under the weight of the snow. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and woodsmoke. It was a simple life, but it was a life filled with purpose and connection. The seasons turned with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each one bringing its own challenges and rewards. Spring brought the thaw and the mud, summer the green fields and the heat, and autumn the harvest and the first frost. Winter was the longest and the hardest, a time of waiting and reflection. As I grew older, a restlessness began to stir within me, urging me to seek something beyond the boundaries of my village. The stories of the saints and the holy men filled my mind with visions of distant lands and sacred places. I felt a call to leave the familiar and to embark on a journey of spiritual discovery. In the year 1893, I decided to make the long trek to the Holy Lands. I packed a small bundle of possessions, a staff for support, and set out on foot. The journey was arduous, requiring great physical endurance and spiritual fortitude. I walked through forests and across frozen rivers, relying on the kindness of strangers for shelter and food. The landscape changed as I moved south, the snow giving way to green fields and rolling hills. I saw cities I had only heard about in stories, their domes and spires rising against the sky. I visited monasteries and churches, listening to the chants of the monks and feeling the weight of history in the stone walls. The journey was not just a physical one. It was a transformation of the soul. I met people from all walks of life, each with their own stories and struggles. I shared their meals and their prayers, learning from their wisdom and their faith. Upon my return, I experienced a profound religious conversion. After visiting a monastery in the year 1897, this spiritual awakening transformed my demeanor and deepened my commitment to a life of asceticism. I began to spend more time in prayer and meditation, often retreating to the wilderness for solitude. The world seemed to open up before me, revealing new depths of meaning and purpose. My reputation as a holy man started to spread throughout the region, drawing the attention of local clergy and believers. I was known for my intense gaze and my ability to offer comfort to those who sought my counsel. The people of Pokrovskoye viewed me with a mixture of awe and suspicion. As my behavior became more unconventional, I rejected some of the traditional social norms of my village, choosing instead to follow my own spiritual path. My influence grew slowly, and I became a figure of both admiration and controversy in my home community. The seeds of my future fame were sown during these early years of spiritual seeking and personal transformation. I eventually felt compelled to leave Siberia again, this time heading toward the capital city of the empire. The journey to St. Petersburg was a new chapter in my life, one that would lead to encounters with kings and queens, and to a destiny that I could not have imagined. The snow in Pokrovskoye was different from the snow in the city. It was pure and untouched, a blanket that covered the sins of the world. In the village, time moved slowly, measured by the rising and setting of the sun and the turning of the seasons. The people lived in harmony with the land, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of nature. Whoop-day! The church was the center of the community, its bell ringing out across the fields and forests. The priest was a respected figure, a guide for the spiritual needs of the people. But there were others who sought a different kind of guidance, a more direct connection to the divine. They came to me with their questions and their fears, seeking answers that the church could not provide. I listened to them with an open heart, offering words of comfort and wisdom. I saw the pain in their eyes and the hope in their hearts. I knew that my role was to be a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a conduit for the grace of God. The path was not easy, and it was fraught with challenges and dangers, but I was driven by a sense of purpose that could not be shaken. I walked the road with a steady step, trusting in the guidance of the spirits that moved within me. One surprising fact about the region was that the village of Pokrovskoye was situated on the banks of the Turmoil River, a waterway that had been a vital trade route for centuries. The river provided a connection to the outside world, bringing travelers and goods to the remote village. It was a source of life and sustenance, its waters feeding the fields and the livestock. The river was also a place of reflection and prayer, its flowing waters a reminder of the passage of time. I often sat by the riverbank, watching the ice form and melt, listening to the sound of the water flowing beneath the surface. The river was a symbol of the continuity of life, a constant presence in a world of change. It connected the past to the present, and the present to the future. The river was a witness to the lives of the people who lived along its banks, their stories etched into its stones and its sand. It was a silent observer, a keeper of secrets, and a bearer of memories. The river was a part of me, just as I was a part of it. Our lives were intertwined, bound together by the rhythms of the water and the land. The river flowed on, carrying the stories of the past into the future, a testament to the enduring power of life. The year 1893 arrived with a wind that stripped the last leaves from the birch trees, leaving the branches bare against a sky the color of bruised iron. I felt a pull in my chest then, a heavy stone, dragging me away from the familiar mud of Pokrovskoye and the warm hearth of my home. My wife, Praskovia, had borne me children, and I had learned the weight of a plow and the rhythm of the harvest. Yet a silence within me grew louder than any village festival. I packed a small bundle with a loaf of dark bread and a worn icon, leaving the rest to the care of those who stayed. The road to Greece was not a path of comfort, but a long, slow unraveling of the self. Step by painful step, I walked through forests where the snow reached my waist, the cold biting through my woolen coat, until my bones ached with a deep, resonant ache. Strangers offered me shelter in their barns, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of tallow candles, smelling of hay and damp earth. I ate what they gave me, simple food that tasted of the soil, and I slept on the hard ground with only the sound of my own breathing to keep me company. The journey took me across frozen rivers, that groaned under the weight of my boots, the ice cracking like a gunshot in the stillness of the morning. I saw the world as a vast, indifferent landscape. Yet within that indifference, I found a strange and quiet peace. When I finally reached the sacred sites of the Orthodox faith, the air felt different, thick with the scent of beeswax and old incense. The monasteries stood on cliffs overlooking the sea, their white walls glowing in the Mediterranean light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. I spent days in prayer, Mike, knees bruised from kneeling on the rough floor, my voice rising in chants that echoed off the ancient walls. The monks there moved with a slowness that I had never known, their eyes holding a depth that seemed to look past the physical world. I learned that the body could be trained to stillness, that the mind could be quieted until it became a mirror for the divine. This was not a sudden explosion of light, but a slow, steady dawn that crept into the corners of my soul. I returned to Russia with a new way of seeing, a way that stripped away the layers of pretense and left only the raw truth of existence. The year 1897 marked a turning point, a moment where the old man died and a new one began to breathe. I felt a fire in my blood that was not of this world, a heat that warmed me even in the deepest winter. The people of my village noticed the change in me, though they could not name it. My gaze became intense, fixed on something they could not see, and my hands, once rough with labor, now moved with a deliberate grace. I spoke less, but when I did, my words carried a weight that silenced the room. Some looked at me with awe, seeing a saint in the rough wool of my tunic, while others looked with suspicion, fearing the unknown. I rejected the social norms that had held me captive, choosing instead to follow the path that my spirit demanded. I walked through the village without a hat, my long beard framing a face that had seen the edge of the world. The children would run after me, not with fear, but with a curious wonder, as if they sensed a different kind of man walking among them. I spent more time in the wilderness, seeking solitude in the deep forests, where the only sound was the wind in the pines. There, in the quiet, I found the answers to questions I had never dared to ask. The silence was not empty. It was full of voices that spoke of a reality beyond the material. I learned to listen to these voices, to let them guide my steps and shape my thoughts. One surprising fact from that time is that the human brain can enter a state of deep meditation, where the perception of time slows down, making hours feel like minutes. I experience this often during my long hours of prayer, where the world outside seemed to dissolve into a haze of light and sound. The boundaries between the self and the universe blurred, leaving only a vast, boundless presence. I would sit for hours, my eyes closed, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath me and the rhythm of the stars above. There I did live. The cold would not bother me, nor would the hunger that gnawed at my stomach. I was sustained by something else, live, a nourishment that came from the depths of my own being. This state of being became my home, a place where I could rest and find peace amidst the chaos of the world. I carried this peace with me wherever I went, a quiet flame that could not be extinguished by the winds of doubt or fear. The reputation of a holy man began to spread through the region, carried by the whispers of those who had sought my counsel. They came from far and wide, bringing their troubles and their questions, seeking a word of comfort or a sign of hope. I listened to them with an open heart, offering them the wisdom that had been given to me in the silence. My words were simple, drawn from the stories of the saints and the lessons of the wilderness, yet they seemed to touch something deep within the souls of those who heard them. I saw the light return to their eyes, the weight of their burdens lifting as they walked away. The clergy took notice of me, some with admiration, others with suspicion, but all with a sense of wonder at the changes they saw. I was a figure of controversy, a man who walked between two worlds, neither fully of the village, nor fully of the monastery. I rejected the traditional norms, choosing instead to follow my own path, a path that was difficult and often lonely. The seeds of my future fame were sown during these early years of spiritual seeking and personal transformation. I felt a growing need to leave Siberia again, to take my message to the heart of the empire, the capital city of St. Petersburg called to me, a place of great power and great darkness, where the light of the divine was often obscured by the shadows of politics. I prepared for the journey, packing my bundle once more, leaving behind the familiar landscapes of my youth. The train ride to the city was a long one, filled with the sights and sounds of a changing world. I saw the industrial cities rising from the fields, the smokestacks belching black clouds into the sky. The contrast between the ancient traditions of the countryside and the modernity of the city was stark, a tension that would shape my time there. I arrived in late 1804, a man of the country, entering a world of stone and steel. The city was a labyrinth of streets and buildings, filled with people who moved with a frantic energy that I found unsettling. Yet, amidst the chaos, I found a way to remain still, to carry the peace of the wilderness into the heart of the city. The air in the palace smelled of beeswax candles and old paper, a scent that reminded me of the monasteries of Greece. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards as the building settled for the night. Outside the tall windows, the snow-covered gardens of the palace lay still under the pale moonlight, a vast white expanse stretching into the darkness. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, sending sparks upward toward the high, painted ceiling where angels watched over the sleeping house. A heavy tapestry depicting a biblical scene hung on the far wall, its threads worn soft by time and touch. The air felt cool and still, carrying the quiet weight of history that permeated every corner of the room. Nothing moved except the slow drift of smoke from the dying embers rising in thin, gray ribbons toward the ceiling. The room seemed to hold its breath, preserving the memory of conversations that had once filled the space with urgency and hope. Time moved slowly here, measured not by clocks, but by the fading light and the turning of seasons outside. The stillness offered a sense of peace, a temporary respite from the chaos that would soon engulf the empire. My relationships with the patrons and rivals of the court created a complex tapestry of loyalty and conflict. The journey from the quiet dirt of Siberia to the marble halls of the capital was not a sudden leap, but a slow, winding climb through the dark. I remember the first time I stepped into a room where the air smelled of wax and old money, a scent so different from the damp earth of home. The heavy doors opened with a groan that seemed to echo in the bones of the building itself. Inside, the light was soft and golden, filtered through high windows that seemed to touch the sky. People moved with a deliberate grace, their silk skirts whispering against the floor, their voices low and measured. I felt the weight of their stares, a physical pressure that pressed against my rough clothes and calloused hands. They saw a peasant, a man who had walked barefoot on frozen ground, standing among men who had never known hunger. The silence in those moments was thick, filled with unspoken judgments and hidden fears. I did not try to match their polish or mimic their words. I simply stood, breathing in the strange air, letting my presence settle like dust in a sunbeam. The court was a place of endless movement, yet it often felt as still as a frozen river. I walked through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who had ruled for centuries, their painted eyes following my every step. The walls were covered in tapestries that told stories of battles and conquests, woven with threads of gold that caught the light. I touched the rough stone of the pillars, feeling the cold seep through my gloves, a reminder of the world outside the palace walls. The heat of the fireplaces fought a constant battle against the winter chill that drifted in from the Neva. I learned to navigate this maze of rooms and secrets, moving with a confidence that surprised even myself. My path was not paved with titles or degrees, but with the simple, raw faith that had sustained me in the villages of the north. I spoke to the Tsar and the Tsarina not as a subject, but as a man who had seen the face of God in the eyes of a dying child. The room where we met was small and intimate, filled with the scent of incense and the faint aroma of tea. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that played across the faces of those who listened. Live. There were whispers that followed me through the halls, carried on the wind of gossip that swept through the city. People spoke in hushed tones about my origins, my habits, and the strange power I seemed to wield. They called me a holy man, a healer, and a charlatan, often in the same breath. The newspapers of the time were filled with stories that painted me as a monster or a saint, rarely capturing the simple truth of who I was. I remember reading an article from July 1914 that described an attack on me by a young woman, a moment of violence that shook the city but did not break my spirit. The knife had cut deep, yet the wound healed live, and the people saw it as a sign of divine protection. I continued to walk the streets of Petrograd, moving through the crowds with a calm that bordered on recklessness. The hostility of my enemies only seemed to strengthen. There I did live the bond I shared with those who believed in me. I did not seek their approval, nor did I fear their threats. Did live. I was guided by a voice that spoke louder than the noise of the city. The winter of 1916 was particularly cold, the snow falling in thick, silent flakes that covered the frozen canals and the roofs of the city. The Moika Palace stood dark against the gray sky, its windows reflecting the faint glow of distant street lamps. Inside the cellar, the air was thick with the smell of damp stone and old wood. A single candle flickered on a rough table, casting long shadows that danced against the peeling plaster walls. The silence was heavy and absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards above. Outside, live? The wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees that lined the frozen canal. The water beneath the ice moved slowly, carrying the cold of the deep winter toward the sea. This quiet moment in the palace cellar marked the end of a turbulent era for the Russian Empire. The room felt small and enclosed, a place where history had turned on itself in a single night. The candlelight illuminated the dust motes that floated lazily in the still air, suspended in time. No sound of the city reached this deep, underground space, creating a sense of isolation from the world above. The stone walls seemed to hold the memory of the events that had just transpired within them. The cold seeped through the cracks in the floor, grounding the space in the reality of the season. It was a place of finality where the fate of a man and a nation had been sealed. The stillness of the room offered a stark contrast to the violence that had occurred there only moments before. The candle flame steadied itself, burning with a steady, unwavering light in the darkness. My influence within the inner circle grew as the war dragged on, a long and bloody conflict that drained the life from the nation. The Serena became increasingly isolated, her world shrinking to the walls of the palace and the advice I offered. She saw in me a source of strength, a man who could reach the divine and bring healing to her suffering son. The boy, Alexei, was plagued by a sickness that no doctor could cure, a condition that brought fear and despair to the royal family. I walked into his room, feeling the tension in the air, and spoke words of comfort that seemed to ease the pain. The mother's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, and in that moment, my place in their lives was secured. I advised her to trust no one but her family and the few who understood the true nature of faith. I warned against the ministers who sought to limit the power of the Tsar, men who cared more for their own positions than the well-being of the empire. These warnings, spoken in the quiet of the palace, contributed to the political instability that would eventually bring it all down. The court was a web of suspicion and fear, where every word was weighed and every gesture analyzed. I moved through it with a simplicity that confused those who were used to the complex games of power. The archives of the time hold the silence of the truth, contrasting sharply with the loud noise of the newspapers that covered my death. The public imagination ran wild, creating myths that were far more dramatic than the reality of my life. I was a man of the people, a peasant who had risen through the ranks of society by the strength of his spirit. My death became a symbol of the decay that had set in, a final act in a tragedy that was playing out across the nation. The date of my passing was December 30th, 1916, in the new calendar, which corresponded to December 17 in the old Russian calendar. The forensic evidence later showed that I died from a gunshot wound to the forehead, a contact shot that ended my life before I was placed in the river. The stories of poison and cyanide were fabrications created by those who sought to justify the actions of their hands. The narrative of my death was largely based on the memoirs of Prince Yusupov, who wrote to defend his role in the event. Some accounts mention Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich as a conspirator, though the primary text names only Yusupov and his group. Yusupov described Purishkevich firing at me from a distance as I ran across the courtyard, attempting to escape. The press quickly filled the void left by my absence with sensational stories and speculative details about my final moments. I was far more famous after my death than during my lifetime, as the public imagination took hold and created a legend that would endure for generations. The soft light of a winter afternoon filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of a St. Petersburg drawing room. A porcelain tea set sat untouched on a lacquered table, its surface reflecting the faint glow of a dying fire. Dust motes danced slowly in the air, suspended in the quiet warmth of the heated space. Outside, The snow fell in silent, thick flakes against the frosted glass, muffling the distant sounds of the city. Live? The room smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper, and there I did live. A scent that lingered in the corners of the furniture. Shadows stretched long across the Persian rug, marking the slow passage of time. Without urgency or alarm, a small icon of the Virgin Mary hung on the wall, its gold leaf catching the last rays of the sun. The silence was deep and complete, wrapping the room in a blanket of peaceful stillness that felt timeless and enduring. In this quiet space, the chaos of the world seemed distant, a memory of a life that had passed. The tea had gone cold. The steam long since vanished, leaving only the scent of the leaves behind. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing with a faint red light that pulsed in the darkness. The room held the echo of voices that had spoken of faith and fear, of love and loss. It was a place where the past and the present met, where the stories of the living and the dead intertwined. My wife, Praskovia, had been a constant presence in my life, a woman of strength and quiet dignity. We had married in 1887, and she had stood by me through the long years of travel and prayer. She understood the nature of my calling, even when the world did not. Her love was a steady force, a grounding, the city of Stain. Petersburg arrived with a noise that never truly ceased, a constant hum of carriages and shouting that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of the bone. I walked through streets paved with stone that felt slippery under my boots, where the air smelled of wet coal and the sharp tang of the Neva River. The grand buildings rose like cliffs of white and gray, their windows reflecting a sky that was often the color of a bruised plum. People moved in great rivers of dark coats, their faces turned inward, hiding from the cold and from each other. I felt small in this vast machine of an empire, a single grain of sand caught in a grinding wheel. The pressure of the times pressed down on the chest, live. A weight that made every breath a conscious effort. Workers gathered in the factories with a quiet fury, their hands rough and stained with grease, demanding bread and a voice in their own fate. The intellectuals spoke in hushed tones in coffee houses, their words sharp as broken glass, debating the future of a nation that seemed to be crumbling from within. The old ways of the Tsar stood firm against these new tides, but the water was rising, and the dam could not hold forever. I saw the fear in the eyes of the ministers as they navigated the labyrinth of court politics, their decisions made in rooms thick with the smoke of expensive cigars. The atmosphere was heavy with suspicion, where every whisper could be a dagger and every smile a mask. Rumors began to circulate about a man from the north, a figure who walked with a limp and spoke live with a voice that carried the dust of the steppe. These whispers grew into shouts as the newspapers printed stories that painted me as a charlatan or a saint, depending on the ink they used. A report in February of 1912 claimed that I held the reins of the empire in my rough hands, that the Duma feared me as a sorcerer. The words spread through the capital like a fire in dry grass, igniting a panic that had no clear source. I saw the confusion in the faces of the common people who looked at the palace gates and wondered who truly ruled the land. The description of a Siberian peasant as the master of the Tsar shocked the world, yet it was a truth that lived in the quiet moments of the palace. The war began in the summer of 1914, bringing a fresh wave of chaos that swept across the borders and into the heart of the home. Russia entered the conflict with a song in its throat, but the song turned to a scream as the losses mounted on the Eastern Front. The economy strained under the weight of the guns and the uniforms, and the social divisions deepened into chasms that could not be bridged. Ministers came and went like leaves in the wind, their names forgotten before the ink on their decrees had dried. The lack of clear records about my own life added to the mystery, a fog that wrapped around the truth and made it impossible to see. Some called me by one name, others by another, and the confusion reflected the broader uncertainty of the era. The provided texts do not speak of my finances or the investigations that would come later, leaving a silence where facts should have been. This silence became a canvas upon which the fears of the nation were projected, a blank space filled with the darkest imaginings of the public. I walked through the corridors of power, not as a ruler, but as a man trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The bonds I formed with the royal family were fragile, woven from threads of faith and desperation, yet they held firm for a time. The Tsar wrote in his diary that our first meeting lasted far longer than scheduled. A sign of a connection that defied the logic of the court. The Tsarina looked at me with eyes that sought salvation in a world that offered none, and I offered what little I had. The political landscape shifted with the seasons, but the storm was always there, waiting to break. The press continued to print their stories, fueled by the anxiety of a people who felt the ground shaking beneath their feet. There I did live. The image of the holy devil grew stronger than the man, a legend that would outlive the flesh that created it. The simple icons of my youth had prepared me for this role, teaching me that the image is often more powerful than the reality. I became a symbol of everything the empire feared and everything it needed, a mirror reflecting the contradictions of a dying age. The journey from the village to the palace, live, was a journey through the visual history of Russia, each step adding a layer to the mask I wore. The pilgrimage to the Holy Lands had given me a deeper connection to the ancient traditions, but the capital demanded something new and strange. The artistic development of the era was influenced by the search for meaning in a fragmented world, and I was part of that search. The art of the time reflected the tension between the old faith and the new reality, a struggle that played out in the streets and the salons. I remained a constant figure in this shifting landscape, a reminder of the enduring power of faith and tradition. The legacy of my life is found in the enduring power of the image I became, a figure that continues to haunt the historical memory of Russia. The heavy velvet curtains in the imperial drawing room hung in folds that seemed to swallow the light, their deep crimson color fading to a dull purple in the corners. A brass candelabra stood on a marble table, its candles unlit and covered in a thin layer of dust that caught the faint glow from the street lamps outside. The floor was made of polished wood, reflecting the shadows of the furniture with a clarity that made the room feel larger than it was. A single chair sat in the center of the space, its upholstery worn smooth by the weight of many anxious sittings. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of dried lavender and old paper that had been left in the sun. Outside, the wind howled against the glass, a low and mournful sound that seemed to echo the unrest of the city. The silence in the room was not empty, but filled with the unspoken words of those who had sat there before, live, their worries lingering in the fabric of the chairs. The light from the street filtered through the heavy drapes, creating long, pale stripes on the floor that moved slowly as the moon climbed higher. It was a place of waiting, where the fate of an empire was decided in the quiet moments between the storms. The narrative of my life is inextricably linked to the people I met and the trust I earned, a tapestry of connections that defined the final days of the dynasty. Scholars continue to study these relationships to understand the dynamics of power and faith in the early 20th century, but the truth is found in the feeling of the moment. The bonds I formed were as fragile as they were strong, destined to break under the pressure of revolution. Yet they held firm for a time. The memory of these connections remains a vital part of the historical record, a testament to the enduring human need for connection in a world that was falling apart. The story of my life is one of faith, power, and the complex web of relationships that shaped the course of history. The Russian Empire entered the 20th century under the weight of ancient traditions and growing modern pressures, a beast that was slow to change. Tsar Nicholas II ruled as an autocrat while facing demands for political reform from a restless population that could no longer be ignored. The Industrial Revolution transformed cities, but left rural peasants in deep poverty and uncertainty, a divide that grew wider with every passing year. Social unrest grew steadily as workers organized strikes and demanded better conditions across the vast nation, their voices rising like a tide. Intellectuals debated the future of Russia while the monarchy struggled to adapt to rapid change, their arguments echoing in the halls of power. The political environment became increasingly volatile as revolutionary groups gained strength and influence, their shadows lengthening across the map. Foreign observers watched with concern as internal tensions threatened the stability of the empire, seeing the cracks that were spreading through the foundation. The court at St. Petersburg remained isolated from the suffering of ordinary citizens in the provinces, a bubble of luxury in a sea of hardship. Ministers advised the Tsar on complex matters of state while navigating a labyrinth of competing interests, their paths often crossing with mine. The atmosphere in the capital was thick with suspicion and whispered rumors about the government, a fog that obscured the truth. By 1910, the press had broken the first scandals about me, making my name known throughout Russia and beyond. These early reports introduced a figure who would come to dominate the public imagination, a man of contradictions and mystery. Rumors circulated that I was a member of the Klist sect, an extreme religious. The path away from the village was not a straight line, but a winding trail through deep snow and frozen forests, a journey that stripped away the layers of ordinary life until only the raw spirit remained. I walked with a staff in one hand and a small bundle on my back, feeling the weight of the world shift from my shoulders to the soles of my boots. The cold air bit at my cheeks, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke. I moved through landscapes that seemed to have existed since the beginning of time, untouched by the hands of men or the noise of industry. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional call of a bird seeking shelter in the bare branches. This solitude was not lonely. It was a conversation with the earth itself, a dialogue that required no words, only presence. I felt the pull of something greater, a magnetic force drawing me toward the sacred sites of the Orthodox faith in Greece and the Holy Lands. The year was 1893, and the decision to leave felt as natural as the river flowing toward the sea. I carried no maps, only the knowledge of the road and the trust that strangers would offer shelter. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the journey was arduous, demanding a physical endurance that tested the limits of my body and the strength of my will. I slept in barns and huddled by fires in the open, relying on the kindness of those I met along the way. Each encounter was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the world is vast and full of both danger and grace. The frozen rivers were treacherous, their surfaces hiding deep cracks that could swallow a traveler whole, and yet I crossed them with a steady step, guided by the light of the moon and the stars. I saw the world not as a collection of objects, but as a living tapestry of light and shadow, where every stone and every tree held a story. The restlessness that had gnawed at me in Pokrovskoye began to settle, replaced by a deep, resonant peace that grew with every step I took. I returned to Russia changed, the seeds of a new understanding taking root in the soil of my soul. The year 1897 marked a turning point, a moment when the spiritual awakening became a tangible force that reshaped my entire being. I felt a profound connection to the divine, a sense of unity that transcended the boundaries of the self and the world. This transformation was not sudden, but gradual, like the slow growth of a tree in the spring, its roots digging deep into the earth while its branches reached for the sky. I began to spend more time in prayer and meditation, retreating to the wilderness, where the silence was absolute and the air was pure. The people of my village watched me with a mixture of awe and suspicion, their eyes following my every move as I walked the narrow paths between the fields. They saw a man who had returned from the dead, or perhaps a man who had never truly been alive in the way they understood life. My behavior became unconventional, rejecting the social norms that had governed my existence for so long. I chose to follow a different path, one that led away from the comfort of the familiar and into the unknown. The seeds of my future fame were sown during these early years of spiritual seeking, a quiet revolution that would eventually shake the foundations of the empire. The room was small and dimly lit, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a beeswax candle that cast long, dancing shadows against the rough wooden walls. The air smelled of old paper and dried herbs, a scent that lingered in the corners of the space, mingling with the faint aroma of the snow outside. A heavy tapestry hung on the far wall, its threads worn soft by time and touch, depicting a scene of saints and angels that seemed to watch over the room with a silent, knowing gaze. The floorboards creaked gently under the weight of the furniture, a rhythmic sound that matched the slow, steady beat of a resting heart. Outside the tall windows, the snow-covered gardens lay still under the pale moonlight, a vast white expanse stretching into the darkness, untouched by the chaos that would soon engulf the empire. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, sending sparks upward toward the high ceiling, where the painted figures of angels seemed to drift in the smoke. Nothing moved except the slow drift of smoke from the dying embers, rising in thin, live, gray ribbons that dissolved into the stillness of the air. The room seemed to hold its breath, live, preserving the memory of conversations that had once filled the space with urgency and hope. Time moved slowly here, measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the fading light and the turning of the seasons outside. The stillness offered a sense of peace, a temporary respite from the turmoil that raged in the world beyond the walls. I felt the weight of the capital city pressing down on me. As I arrived in St. Petersburg in late 1804, a place of new artistic movements and old traditions colliding in a dizzying dance, the city was a labyrinth of stone and snow, where the grandeur of the palace stood in stark contrast to the poverty of the streets. I walked through the halls of power, my rough woolen garments and long beard marking me as an outsider in a world of silk and satin. Yet there was a strange familiarity in the air, a sense of continuity that connected me to the ancient icons I had loved in my youth. The light in the palace was different from the light of the Holy Lands, yet it carried the same spiritual charge, a glow that seemed to emanate from the gold leaf of the icons that adorned the walls. I saw how the artists of the city sought to break away from the past, embracing modernity and rejecting the old ways, but I remained anchored in the traditions that had shaped my soul. My presence in the court was a testament to the power of the old faith, a reminder that the past was not dead, but alive in the hearts of those who remembered. The Tsar and Serena looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear, their eyes reflecting the uncertainty of a world on the brink of change. I became a figure of both admiration and controversy, a man who could offer comfort to the suffering and guidance to the lost. My influence grew slowly, spreading through the corridors of power like a slow, moving river, carving a path through the resistance of the elite. The bonds I formed were as fragile as they were strong, destined to break under the pressure of revolution, yet for a time they held firm. I navigated the treacherous waters of court politics with a resilience that surprised even myself, adapting to the changing tides while remaining true to my inner compass. The death of the Tsarevich's health crisis provided the foundation for my enduring presence in the palace, a role that I accepted with a heavy heart and a clear mind. I knew that my time in this world was limited, that the storm was coming, but I also knew that I had a part to play in the unfolding drama. The story of my relationship serves as a reminder of the power of personal connection in times of crisis, illustrating how a single individual can alter the course of history through the strength of their influence. The legacy of my life is found not in any specific work I created, but in the way I became an image itself, a canvas upon which the hopes and fears of a nation were projected. The simple icons of my youth had prepared me to understand this role long before I arrived in the capital, teaching me that the spiritual truth is often hidden in the simplest of forms. The journey from the Siberian village to the imperial court was a journey through the visual history of Russia, each step adding a new layer to the complex image that I presented to the world. The pilgrimage to the Holy Lands provided me with a deeper connection to the ancient traditions that defined my identity, a connection that remained unbroken even in the heart of the modern world. I carried the visual memory of these sacred images throughout my long and wandering life, seeing the world through the lens of the icons that had shaped my soul. The light in these sacred spaces seemed to the final years unfolded under a sky that seemed to press down with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Live. I walked through the streets of Petrograd, knowing that the air itself had turned against me. The snow fell softly, masking the footsteps of those who waited in the shadows for my end. My influence over the imperial court remained a source of deep anxiety for the aristocracy, a thorn in their side that refused to be pulled. They viewed me as a corrupting force, a man who threatened the stability of the monarchy with my very presence. Yet I continued to advise the Tsar and the Tsarina with an unwavering confidence that baffled them. My words carried a weight that no title could bestow, a quiet authority born of the soil and the long nights of prayer. The elite whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward me with a mixture of hatred and desperate hope. They believed that removing me was the only way to save the throne from further disgrace. A clique of pro-Tsarist assassins eventually stopped my activities in the winter of 1916. The date of my death was December 30th, 1916, which corresponded to December 17 in the Russian calendar used by the Church. The historical record remains clear on the facts of this end, even as interpretations of my life vary widely among scholars. I was a peasant who rose to prominence through claimed spiritual gifts, a man who broke the traditional barriers of class by addressing everyone with the informal tie. My mannerisms included giving women big hugs and wet kisses, actions that scandalized the conservative clergy and the aristocracy alike. These behaviors created a complex reputation that oscillated between holy mystic and dangerous charlatan. In the public imagination, the soft light of a winter afternoon filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of a St. Petersburg drawing room. A porcelain tea set sat untouched on a lacquered table, its surface reflecting the faint glow of a dying fire. Dust motes danced slowly in the single beam that pierced the gloom of the afternoon. An old porcelain teacup sat on a wooden table, its surface cracked, but still holding a faint warmth. The silence of the room was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a sleigh bell. Live. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards as the sun began its slow descent behind the Neva River. The air smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper, a scent that lingered in the stillness. A small icon of the Virgin Mary hung on the wall, its gold leaf tarnished by time. The room felt suspended in a moment of peace, untouched by the turmoil outside the window. The heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the city, creating a sanctuary of quiet reflection. The light faded gradually, leaving the room in a soft, gray twilight that invited rest. The murder took place in the cellar of the Moika Palace in St. Petersburg, where Prince Yusupov and his co-conspirators waited in the dark. They viewed me as a threat that had to be eliminated to preserve their world. The story of my death was repeated and embellished until it became the accepted version of events for the masses. Historians now work to separate the factual elements from the legendary tales that surround my name. The absence of poison in my body challenges the dramatic narrative of a slow, agonizing death by cyanide. Forensic evidence later indicated that I died from a contact gunshot wound to the forehead before being placed in the Little Nevka River. The autopsy results showed an absence of poison, a fact that contradicts the stories of a man who could not be killed by mere poison. The contact gunshot wound suggests a more direct and immediate end to my life than the memoirs describe. The true story of my final days remains a subject of scholarly debate and careful examination. My influence on the Romanov dynasty ended with my death, but my name endured in the public consciousness. The image of the mystic peasant who ruled the Tsar through superstition became a lasting part of Russian history. This image persisted long after the facts of my life had been obscured by the passage of time. My late life was a time of increasing isolation and danger for me. I walked through the streets of Petrograd, knowing that many wanted me dead. My final years were marked by a sense of inevitability that I could not escape. The assassination was the culmination of years of growing resentment and political maneuvering. The events of that December night changed the course of Russian history in ways that no one could have predicted. The death of Rasputin did not save the monarchy, but it accelerated its fall. The world moved on, but the story of the mad monk remained a fixture of historical memory. The immediate press coverage in early 1917 portrayed me as a mystic peasant who ruled the Tsar through superstition. This narrative suggested that the Tsar allowed a depraved peasant to run the empire. The majority of articles about me appeared in the period between December 1916 and September 1917. These publications often portrayed me as a figure of evil or a saintly healer, rarely capturing the complexity of the man himself. The historical memory of my life shifted dramatically after my violent end in the winter of 1916. I became far more famous after my death than I ever was during my own lifetime. The quiet room in a St. Petersburg apartment held a heavy velvet curtain drawn against the winter light. Dust motes danced slowly in the single beam that pierced the gloom of the afternoon. An old porcelain teacup sat on a wooden table, its surface cracked, but still holding a faint warmth. The silence of the room was profound, broken only by the distant sound of a sleigh bell. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards as the sun began its slow descent behind the Neva River. The air smelled faintly of dried lavender and old paper, a scent that lingered in the stillness. A small icon of the Virgin Mary hung on the wall, its gold leaf tarnished by time. The room felt suspended in a moment of peace, untouched by the turmoil outside the window. The heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the city, creating a sanctuary of quiet reflection. The light faded gradually, leaving the room in a soft, gray twilight that invited rest. The winter night in Petrograd was cold and still as the snow fell softly over the frozen Neva River. The Moika Palace stood dark against the gray sky, its windows reflecting the faint glow of distant street lamps. inside the cellar. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and old wood. A single candle flickered on a rough table, casting long shadows that danced against the peeling plaster walls. The silence was heavy and absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards above. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees that lined the frozen canal. The water beneath the ice moved slowly, carrying the cold of the deep winter toward the sea. This quiet moment in the palace cellar marked the end of a turbulent era for the Russian Empire. The room felt small and enclosed, a place where history had turned on itself in a single night. The candlelight illuminated the dust motes that floated lazily in the still air, suspended in time. No sound of the city reached this deep underground space, creating a sense of isolation from the world above. The stone walls seemed to hold the memory of the events that had just transpired within them. The cold seeped through the cracks in the floor, grounding the space in the reality of the season. It was a place of finality where the fate of a man and a nation had been sealed. The stillness of the room offered a stark contrast to the violence that had occurred there only moments before. The candle flame steadied itself, burning with a steady, unwavering light in the darkness. My legacy was shaped more by the myths created after my death than by the facts of my life. The personal life of Rasputin reflected the broader tensions of a society on the brink of revolution. I remained a figure. The snow that covered the Moika Palace that winter did not stay for long, but the stories it buried grew deeper with every passing year. My name became a ghost before my body was even cold, a shadow that stretched longer than my life ever had. In the days following that violent end, the newspapers filled with ink that smelled of cheap paper and hurried press runs. They painted me as a monster or a saint, rarely allowing space for the simple man who just wanted to be heard. The public needed a villain to explain the crumbling of their world, and they found one in the rough clothes of a Siberian peasant. They said I held the Tsar by a string, that I pulled the levers of empire from a dark cellar. This was the story they told over and over until it became the only truth anyone remembered. I walked the streets of Petrograd, knowing the eyes that followed me were filled with hate, yet I could not see the full scope of the storm I was about to become. The assassination was meant to save the monarchy, a desperate act by men who believed honor could be restored with a bullet. Instead, it shattered the last fragile threads of trust holding the dynasty together. The world moved on to the revolution, to the red flags and the new order. But my legend refused to die. It grew in the dark, fed by the whispers of those who feared the past life and the hopes of those who wanted to destroy it. The facts of my life were buried under layers of rumor, like stones under a riverbed, worn smooth by the constant flow of myth. For decades, the image of the holy devil remained the only face the world saw. He appeared in plays where actors wore heavy masks and spoke in exaggerated tones. He appeared in films where the lighting was dramatic and the music swelled to match the tension of the crowd. These stories were not about the man I was, but about the fear I represented. They were cautionary tales told to children, warnings about what happens when a peasant steps too far into the palace. The narrative of the evil monk persisted long after the bodies were buried in the snow. and the river ice had melted. It became a fixture of historical memory, a permanent scar on the story of Imperial Russia. The silence of the archive room is heavy with dust and the smell of old paper. A single wooden table holds a stack of bound documents, their spines cracked from years of handling. The light from a high window falls across the surface, illuminating particles that float in the air like tiny stars. The ink on the pages has faded to a soft brown, the handwriting sharp and hurried, capturing moments that happened a century ago. The paper feels rough under the fingertips, brittle with age, yet it holds the weight of entire nations. Outside, the city continues its slow, steady rhythm, unaware of the quiet arguments happening within these walls. Scholars lean over the tables, turning pages with care, searching for the truth hidden between the lines of the legend. Modern historians now work to separate the factual elements from the legendary tales that surround the name. They found that the actual political power was far less than the public believed at the time. The myth of control was a convenient explanation for a complex political failure that had many causes. The truth was that the monarchy had already lost its way before the peasant arrived in the capital. The absence of poison in the body challenged the dramatic narrative of a slow, agonizing death by cyanide. The contact gunshot wound suggested a more direct and immediate end to the life than the memoirs described. These details did not diminish the story, but they added a layer of human complexity to the myth. The story served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked influence within a court and the vulnerability of a system that relied on divine right without popular support. It highlighted how a single figure could come to symbolize the end of an entire era. The critical reception of the life has softened as new archives opened in recent years, revealing a man who was more than just a symbol. He was a complex figure who defied simple categorization, a man of contradictions who lived in a time of contradictions. The legacy remains a subject of debate among historians and the general public alike, a puzzle that never seems fully solved. The fascination continues to captivate audiences who seek to understand the final days of Imperial Russia. The man himself is often forgotten, while the legend of the holy devil endures in the collective memory. Live, the historical record shows that he was a peasant who rose to prominence through his claimed spiritual gifts, and whose death became a symbol of the decay of the old order. The stories of the murder were repeated and embellished until they became the accepted version of events. The true story of the final days remains a subject of scholarly debate and careful examination, a quiet pursuit of facts in a world of noise. The image of the mystic peasant who ruled the Tsar through superstition became a lasting part of Russian history. This image persisted long after the facts of the life had been obscured by the passage of time. Well, the late life was a time of increasing isolation and danger, a period of walking through the streets knowing that many wanted death. The final years were marked by a sense of inevitability that could not be escaped. The assassination was the culmination of years of growing resentment and political maneuvering, a final act in a long drama. The events of that December night changed the course of Russian history in ways that no one could have predicted. The death did not save the monarchy, but it accelerated its fall, a final push over the edge. The world moved on, but the story of the mad monk remained a fixture of historical memory. The legacy shifted dramatically after the violent end in the winter of 1916. He became far more famous after the death than he ever was during the own lifetime. The immediate press coverage in early 1917 portrayed him as a mystic peasant who ruled the Tsar through superstition. This narrative suggested that the Tsar allowed a depraved peasant to run the empire, a story that distorted the historical record of the revolution. Many articles from the era between December 1916 and September 1917 focused heavily on the character. The belief that he controlled the Tsar became a central theme in the collapse of public trust. Historians noted that the royal family was already fragile before the rumors of the influence spread. The assassination by Prince Yusupov and his co-conspirators was intended to restore honor to the crown. Instead, the event accelerated the downfall of the Romanov dynasty in the following year. The narrative of the evil monk persisted long after the bodies were buried in the snow.